happen to you? Well, payday comes and you can't pay your rent 'cause every dime you made is already spent. Changes we all go through. You better watch yourself or it can happen to you. Doggone changes. Anytime, anywhere. Well, when your lover leaves and tell you bye-bye, you have nothing left to do but cry, cry, cry. Changes we all go through. Sooner or later, it's gonna happen to you. That's right. Yes, time goes on and you lose your youth. You realize you can't do what you used to. Changes we all go through. You better be careful, or you'll be singing the blues. Changes all go through. You better be careful, or it can happen to you. Yeah, those changes. You better watch yourself, or it can happen to you. I told you to watch. You better watch them changes. Yeah, you better watch them. I done told you. It's left up to you now. Doggone changes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And good afternoon. I know we just finished a wonderful luncheon, and this has been a wonderful day and a wonderful convention. I am Oscar Tillman, and I am a member of the National Board of Directors. I am the president of the Phoenix, Maricopa County NAACP in Phoenix, Arizona. And this afternoon, I will be presiding at this session. At this time, joining me is my parliamentarian, Nate Miles, who is a member of the NAACP National Special Contribution Fund Board of Trustees from Seattle, Washington. Now, as we began everything, I am bringing on Rabbi Yocheved Mentz from the congregation Panai Tiva in Las Vegas, Nevada, for our invocation.
I feel honored and privileged to be with the NAACP and to deliver this invocation. I have to tell you, I feel like I've come full circle. Having been a young wife and mother demonstrating in the 50s and 60s in Chicago, marching with a toddler on my back and an infant on my front, protesting for equality, for justice, and here we are, half century later. Much has been accomplished, but there is so much more that remains to be accomplished. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., may his memory be for a blessing, said, quote, "Every person of humane convictions must decide on the protest that best suits his, and I add hers, convictions, but we must all protest," end quote. Now the what, the why, the how one protests, that becomes a very individual and personal matter. And so I ask Eloheinu, our God, who has filled the world with so many good and wise people, grant us the humility to learn from our teachers, to recognize that we can learn from each and every human being, regardless of color, creed, or faith tradition. Give us the capacity to hear one another, the ability to distinguish wisdom from folly, and the willingness to embrace new thoughts. Avinu Sheba Shamayim, our heavenly parent, grace this convening multitude with wisdom, clarity of protest and of pursuit. Let them hear their leadership and listen intently to one another. Let them be open to the voices of those of the past and those not privileged to be here today. Let them be fortified and strengthened to go forth with renewed direction. Let them not be lulled with apathy, but inspired to action. Bless all present with inspiration, understanding, vision, and determination, and let us say, amen.
I want to thank Reverend Mintz. And at this time, it is a pleasure to invite our moderator for this evening, this afternoon, for this plenary session, Black Turnout for the 2014 midterm elections and the fight against voter suppression. And that is a friend of mine who I respected for many years for what he's done, and that is Roland Martin. Journalist, syndicated columnist, and author from Washington, D.C., and Mr. Martin will introduce our guest speakers. Mr. Martin.
All right, thanks, sir. Appreciate it. So how we doing? Sound like y'all just had lunch. I think y'all can do better than that. How are we doing? All right, then, there you go. Certainly glad to be with you. It's always a shift to be here in Vegas. My body's still on East Coast time. I had to do my radio show at 4 a.m. today. So stop texting me about getting together for breakfast. I finished the show and I went to bed. So glad to be with you. We're looking forward to having a great conversation here about the 2014 midterms election, but also the issue of voter suppression. We'll also, in addition, this is being live streamed, NAACP.org. You can use the hashtag NAACP105 as well as the hashtag voting rights. And so let folks know who are not here on your various social media accounts so they can actually watch this. And we also are shooting this because we're going to air a portion of this on my TV One show, News One Now, which is, of course, our daily morning news show targeted for black folks, where I always say we have no problem being unapologetically black. So I want to get right to introduce our panel right here. First up, sitting to my left, he is the president of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, National Board Member. We have Dr. William J. Barber. Cristobal Alex, he is the president of Latino Victory Project and Latino Victory Foundation. Round of applause. She is the minority leader in the Georgia House, Representative Stacey Abrams. Senior advisor to the president and CEO of the NAACP, but also senior director for voting rights at the NAACP. I'll say, I'm gonna call you Joe Taka. She said Joe Taka Edie. Next up, someone, you see a familiar face, actually familiar hair, not face. He is president of Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies, also is a political contributor for CNN, and he is one of the top Democratic strategists, Cornell Belcher. You can always tell this is an important event because normally Cornell has tennis shoes on. He decided to actually wear his church shoes. So we appreciate you even putting on some socks for the NAACP, Cornell. And they're very conservative socks too, my goodness. I thought you were gonna wear some color like I did, but no, you decided to go, but at least no socks, that means you're not ashy. That's good, all right. And
black people right here.
That's right, because anytime you moderate a panel with black people, bring your lotion, we don't do ash. And we have on the far end, we have Ryan Haygood. Ryan is the Director of Political Participation Group for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Funds. We have different panelists who are focused on different areas, but I want to start our conversation this way to sort of set this up. This is going to be a give and take. Folks get to jump in. We're also going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. And so when we get to that part, I'll step down and I will I'll get to you to answer the question because, you know, some folks get a hold of the mic, then we're going to be here until the gospel concert. So I'm going to handle that part. So I want to get right to it with our panel here. It's very interesting when you look at how people vote. So much attention is focused on presidential campaigns because national media is focused on that. You have your newspapers, your websites, your blogs, your radio. It's all focused on that. But it's a whole lot different when you're trying to get people to understand how the midterm elections, although you have congressional races, some senatorial races, the real impact of midterm elections, what actually happens on the state level. In terms of governor's mansions, state representatives, state senators. And so how do you frame this to get the average voter to understand that what takes place in November, I would say, is arguably more important than what happens in a presidential year? Anybody can jump in.
I have an opinion.
Go right in. I told y'all, don't raise your hand, just go.
No, as the House Minority Leader, a great deal of my job is trying to explain to our citizens why we matter. But if you want to know why there's voter suppression in the United States, it's because your state legislatures are allowing it. If you want to know why there's no trash pickup on your street, that's because your city council didn't do it. It's making sure we connect the dots between what these jobs are and what we should expect. But the larger piece is making certain that people understand that these are jobs, that we are hiring people on the local level to do things for you, and that if you don't participate in that job evaluation, which is election day, you are simply saying that they're doing a good job. And that's what we take from it. So it's really taking it out of the ether, which is where the presidential election lies, and really making it local, making sure people understand that the things that we oppose or the things that we support happen locally, and if you want to have a voice, you have to make sure you participate and pick that person.
But also,
I want to jump in here, and Representative Abrams is exactly right, but I think also equally important is what happens when we don't turn out in those elections. We focus so much on the presidential elections, but in 2010, and I don't know, many of you were in the membership luncheon, and Elaine Jones, who's always amazing, she pointed out, you know, we saw a major shift in 2010. And what we saw was a shift in control of power at the state, governor's level and at the state legislative level.
16 state legislatures flipped to total Republican control in 2010.
Absolutely, and as a result, we saw a wave of voter suppression laws, the attacks on women's rights, the attack on workers' rights as a result. So I think it's really dire for us to understand that we've got to vote in all of these elections.
And if I can jump in, I mean, part of us understanding the landscape here is, and we talk a lot about 2010, and people think 2010 was an election where, you know, massive number of people changed their minds. And the truth of the matter is 2010 wasn't that at all. It was an ebb election where, frankly, that electorate who came out in 2008 and changed the face of the electorate, you know, 11% of our electorate in 2008 was brand new electorate. And for those in politics, we know that's a really big deal because that seldom to never happens. But we also knew we had to do that in order to elect Barack Obama. But that electorate, you know, in fact, stayed home, and other sides' base electorate was energized. When you run the voter file and look at sort of talk about drop off in battleground states, when you look at precincts, you know, Republican 65 plus precincts, their base precincts, and Democrats 65 plus precincts, Democrats base precincts, by the way, which is where a lot of us live, is a 16-point difference in turnout. Their base precincts barely drop off at all. And ours dropped off at 16 points. Now, when that's happening, that's the election right there. In a nutshell, when you have that sort of dramatic drop-off from our precincts and theirs barely dropping off at all, that's how 2010 happens. And I'm afraid that we're right now, I think we're in a position to have 2010 all over again if we don't do something dramatically different.
Roland, I would just say to your point, I really appreciate your focus on these local jurisdictions, because it's really in those places, as you all know well, where we see a lot of discrimination happening. So it's true that discrimination happens at the statewide level and in federal elections, but it's equally true that we see a tremendous amount of discrimination happening in the local places, on the local city councils, and the county commissions. And we've seen this in the wake of the devastating Shelby County decision the Supreme Court handed down the last term, where we lost the core provision of the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 when the Supreme Court struck Section 4B, which was a mechanism that applied Section 5 to the places where it applied. So folks know that Section 5 really, for almost 50 years, served as our democracy discrimination checkpoint, in that it required certain jurisdictions to submit all of their voting changes to the federal government before they could be approved. In the absence of Section 5, we've seen a host of local jurisdictions do many things that would be very harmful to minority voters. In President Johnson's state of Georgia, we saw in Baker County, Georgia, that the good folks there, in a county where African American participation is very high, but so too is poverty, where there's not public transportation, and where polling places are about 20 miles apart, we saw a move by the election officials there to close 4 of 5 of the polling places. And when we inquired about the rationale for closing these polling places, the election officials there told us that they were doing so as a cost savings measure. So they wanted to close 4 of 5 polling places, each located about 20 miles apart, and they would have saved a grand total of $8,000. So the reality, right, folks chuckle at that, but the reality is we've seen Baker counties happen all over the places where Section 5 previously was in effect. And so I appreciate Roland's focus on these local jurisdictions, because part of our charge to you today is that we need you in the absence of Section 5 for now. And until Congress acts to restore the Voting Rights Act, we need you to be our eyes and ears on the ground in those local places.
But I want to push it even further than that. I want the two of you to jump in on that, because if we say we need you until then, the reality is, even if the Congress acts, we still need folks to do that, because what happens is, you just talked about it, those local officials. Well, when we ignore the county commissioner, that race, we ignore the county judge, then we also ignore who appoints folks over those various commissions. And it's trying to get people, I do it on the radio all the time, on television, trying to get folks to understand that every single one of those positions can have a dramatic impact on your life every single day.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And if you would turn the slide to number 12 here on the PowerPoint, you said it perfectly when you think about these local elections and what matters. And this is what the Latino community sees right now. We're under attack, not only on the voting rights piece, but on immigration and another round of issues that are coming down the pike that really kind of focus on disenfranchising Latino and African American voters. But political power is really built in these midterm elections, because that's when the local issues come into full relief. And if you click on the next slide, what you'll see here is a picture of a colonia that's here in the United States. That's in the Rio Grande Valley in my home state of Texas. And the census said that's the poorest census tract in the country in 2010. And you can see how poor it is. And they have 1,200 registered voters, but only 150 actually turn out in a regular election in a midterm.
So they have 1,200 registered voters.
Only 150 voted.
150 voted.
And so they went to the local judge and said, what can you do about the conditions of these roads? Look how terrible they are. And the judge said, why bother? Nobody out there votes anyways. So they pushed the judge and said, what would it take to show proof of life? And he said, 300 votes. And if you click on the next slide, you can see what local organizing did. They turned out more than 500 folks. Now look what happens. One more slide, and you'll see the same street a year and a half later. That's what happens when you have political power and people vote in local elections.
And that's the, Stacey, go ahead.
And that's exactly my point. Most voters do not understand what we do. When I say connect the dot, it's explaining what a state legislator does. It's that if you believe that voter suppression is wrong, the people who suppress your votes are your state legislators. If you need a road, it is your county commissioner. But we all, those of us who vote, assume everyone else understands that.
Right.
We have to go into this assuming nobody knows what we do. I don't think my mother knows what I do for a living. And every time we have to explain it, and we have to explain it in terms that are as real as what Cristobal just showed us.
Dr. Barbara, to that point that he just made about the roads there, it sort of reminded me, I mean, I've covered city hall, county government, education as well, and it's very interesting to me. We talk about how valuable education is, yet if you actually took the time to go look at the voting totals in most school board elections, there are people who are being elected literally with 100, 200, and 300 votes. And then they're sitting over millions of dollars in bond projects. They're sitting over the curriculum. They determine who the superintendent is. And really, from an organizing standpoint, as Cristobal just said, if you literally went out and mobilized and organized 2,500 to 3,000 people, you could take over an entire school board.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that's right. The fact of the matter is, extremists have always known that if they want to clog up America and if they want to stop any kind of progressive civil rights agenda, they go to the states. And actually what they're doing is taking our playbook. You know, if you look at it, as I was sharing you in the back in the first Reconstruction, it was the states that changed. The second Reconstruction, third. Dr. King in the March on Washington said, he never said come back to D.C. He said go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, build a state movement. 1974, Charles Koch did a speech, and he said to extremists, listen, we're not going to invest in messiah candidates. We're going to invest in a movement that will produce candidates from the bottom up. And so they invested in think tanks. They took ALEC and all of these groups to the state level. Tea Party went state level. And the only way we can beat them back is we must have strong state movements that challenge them both in the ballot box and in the courts. The reason why it's so important, in 2010, when extremists took over our legislature, first thing they went after, they couldn't do vote ID because we had Section 5, but they went after redistricting. And they stacked and packed 52% of African Americans into 27 out of 120 House districts and 49% of African Americans into 19 out of 50 Senate districts, thereby creating a gerrymandering district so that in 2012, even though 70% of African Americans voted, the most ever in North Carolina, and 120,000 more people voted for progressives, extremists won. Mm-hmm. Not because the vote wasn't turned out, but because they jerry-rigged the election. Who did that? Not a congressperson, not a senator, but a state legislature. And that's why we have to be intently focused on the state government. One representative who voted on voter suppression tried to block a former NAACP Youth Council president from running for city council, won by 12 votes. Wow. 12 votes. That's all. In the city of Elizabeth City, where we have Elizabeth City State University, and then used his power to try to stop Elizabeth City students from voting, but those students rose up and took him on. We beat him at the State Board of Election. These state elections are the future. If we're going to beat back extremism, we got to do it at the state level.
And when you talk about the various state elections, I want to throw this out, and Cornell, I know you want to jump in. If you look at, obviously, Washington, D.C., they clearly don't work. Nobody's working in the nation's capital. But if you look at the actual policy battles they are not taking place in D.C.
That's right.
So the issue of Medicaid, the issue of health, the issue of gay marriage, the issue of civil rights, the issue of economic development, all of these battles, the issue of abortion, all of these battles have shifted away from one place to 50 different places. And what's interesting to me is when I'm talking to various civil rights organizations, I'm talking to other leaders, they still are having a conversation of let's go to D.C. as opposed to, no, we need to hit state capitals. Cornell.
I just want to double down on a couple of points here. One is the gerrymandering of districts, not only at state level, but even profoundly at the federal level, we have to pay more attention to, because right now you have, you know, our founding fathers thought, well, their founding fathers thought the House of Representatives would be sort of the pressure valve of the people. And in this last election, we had over 1 million more people vote Democratic, and we still couldn't pick up the House. Right. And it has to do with gerrymandering, that they've gotten so good at gerrymandering. And both sides, by the way, have been a part of this.
And we just saw it in Florida where the judge threw out the districts there because they said it was clear gerrymandering.
Well, in 1996, think about this. In 1996, we had 100 districts that Bill Clinton carried that GOPers were already in. Right now, we have 17 districts where Barack Obama won and Republicans are. The battlefield is shrinking more and more each election cycle, and it's getting harder and harder to turn the country over. One last point is, Washington isn't working, but it's not working on purpose, because dysfunction is actually a political strategy. Because the Washington Post came out with a story yesterday talking about how the Obama coalition, looking at the Obama coalition, you know, they're dismayed, and you think that dismay would turn into them turning out to vote, but the dismay actually makes them less likely to vote. However, at the same time, when you sue the president and when you want to impeach the president, yes, dysfunction, but it's dysfunction serving a base that continues to energize it. So the dysfunction of Washington, D.C. right now is a concerted political strategy.
But Cornell, I think, go ahead.
One of the
hold on one second. Okay. I think one of the issues, though, when you talk about folks who are dismayed, is because there's a fundamental difference between working and fighting to get somebody elected.
Right.
And when that fight is over, it's a whole different job to do the next day.
Yeah.
And I think unfortunately what happens is we have folks who think, I mean, literally, I remember after the 2008 election, I was on the Wanda Sykes show when she had it on Fox, and she said, well, I did my part, I voted. I said, hell no, there's more work to do. And so part of the deal is getting people to understand that once the election is over, now you got to say, all right, cool, now I got to make sure that the person who I voted for does what I said or what I wanted to do,
and I think,
or the people who are opposing, I got to fight them. Right. Reverend Dr. Barber and then Jotaka.
Democrat or Republican, because the bottom line is we got to stop saying to people what's most important is the election. The election is the first step. You have to have a movement that continues to stay focused. And what I'm saying, and you have to state this, NAACP is really the only national organization statewide that is positioned to keep an independent movement going on, both legally and in the voting booth and policy. And what you have to know is we're not being attacked because of our weakness. The reality is our game changers can fundamentally change America. What we said in education, healthcare, all those things, and they know that. So the only way you can stop it is to stop up the vote. And Moreland, that is why before Shelby, give y'all the story, before Shelby, in North Carolina, the legislature had a simple voter ID, 12-page bill on. After the Shelby decision, in 30 days, the House, under Speaker Tillis, passed a 57-page bill that not only passed the most restrictive voter ID, but ended same-day registration, rolled back early voting, rolled back Sunday voting, disallowed 17-year-olds from pre-registering, ended straight ticket voting, ended provisional voting from being passed. Why? Because if you look down that list, the people we build coalitions with, Latinos, women, and black folk, are most likely to use all of those things. And they did it out of fear, because they know if the electorate is open, they lose.
Absolutely.
They
and
lose.
I have a slide I want to reference here, and what it says is simple, that what this boils down to is that this is an attempt, voter suppression, is an attempt to shift political power in our nation. And I think Reverend Barber is very clear that it is really a fear, because when you look at the demographics, when you look at what came out of the census, it's clear that this nation is getting more brown and more black, and that we are going to become a majority. And in 2008, when you couple the sheer numbers and demographics with what happened, the possibility of that fusion politics, which you're doing such a great job in North Carolina, whenever we pull that together, we see what's possible. And so since 2011, we have seen more than 250 attempts at the state legislative level to suppress voting rights. As a result, we've seen some 22 states pass some suppressive voting rights laws. And the recent statistics that came out from the Brennan Center, it showed that in 2008, the 11 states with the highest turnout of African American voters, 7 now have voter suppression laws that are now in place going into the November midterm election. Of the states with the 12 states with the highest Latino population, 9 now have voter suppression laws. So when you start putting, it's just common sense. When you put it together, you put, the numbers are there, the power is there,
right.
The fear is there, and so they have an unprecedented strategy to suppress our power.
Will?
Yeah, and I would just say, to Joe Jacobs' point, when you look at, pre-Shelby County, in the last 25 years, Section 5 had blocked more than 1,000 proposed discriminatory changes. 80% of those proposed discriminatory changes happened at the local level. And so in the years since Shelby County, we have done a lot of work across the country with state conference NAACP chapters and local branches talking about what the Shelby County decision means broadly and what it means for black people in particular, and how in this moment in American history, millions of African Americans are especially vulnerable in those places that were previously covered by the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 in particular. But 2 interesting things have happened. One, as we've had conversations, we have recognized, to the points that are made here, the many, many structural barriers that we face as black folks, almost 50 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. But we also have been honest in those candid moments about the way in which we have sort of seen Section 5 as Big Brother, right? Section 5 was out there. It was going to block discriminatory changes,
right.
So we relied on it to do that. It's now not there, so it's now on us to seize the moment to identify those changes and to be effective in being eyes and ears on the ground. And another theme has emerged in those conversations, which is to Roland's point about the way in which we often see political participation as a single act. I voted, my candidate won, but we don't also do a good job of ensuring that those folks we've elected are responsive to us. And so candidly, if we get honest, not on the stage, but we have elected officials across the country who have been in office 1 term, 2 terms, more terms than you can count, and they're still there, and they are reliably relying on our votes unconditionally term after term. And it's really on us to be making sure that they're accountable to us, that they're espousing our issues, that they're speaking for us and not taking us for granted.
Well, but go ahead.
I want to jump in. I think the point, Ryan, you're making a very good point, and I think just to take it a little further and be a bit more candid, there are a lot of folks that are in office year after year after year to get elected, but they don't do anything for us. And so I think we have to recognize the fact that when we actually have the numbers to make a difference. And I know, Cornell, you do a lot in looking at all these numbers, but we've actually got to tie the elections to the issues and making sure that we're holding everyone that's elected into office accountable, no matter what party they are. Because on both sides, people are not being held accountable to us.
Let me get more candid for just a second. Even more candid.
Okay, how about this here? Okay.
Because I'm going to talk.
Everybody gonna be damn candid, so just go ahead and just say it. I don't care about ticking somebody off because, well, I'm pretty much used to that. So just go ahead and say it, put it out there.
I'll deny this later. Actually, flip to my graph 7, and I want to make this point. At some point, we're going to
turn to graph 7 for Cornell.
We're going to have to think about, and I know this is painful for us because I love some of them, and both the Congressional Black Caucus, but also the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. But at some point, we're going to have to think about, do these districts where we pack all our vote really expand our power, or does it dilute our power?
And actually, and Cornell, I wanted to go to that point because you were actually on my show and we talked about that in terms of taking a more strategic look at districts where you have African Americans and Hispanics, because what happens is African Americans say, we want a black representative, but then when you look at the numbers, you say it might be advantageous for us not to have that position.
But also look at, Congressman Horsford was here speaking, and his district is a perfect example, I think, of what we got to think about here, where it is and this is the problem because most of them don't want competitive races. But Congressman Horsford here has a competitive race. He has a competitive race because his district is not overwhelmingly African American. We have a large, and full disclosure, I work for him. We have a large chunk of minority voters here, but it is not a safe seat. So you know what Congressman Horsford has to do every year? He has to raise money. He has to build a campaign team. He has to do a lot of things that, quite frankly, you see some of our elected officials not having to do every year, but he has to do it. And by the way, you all should donate money to Congressman Horsford's campaign.
Christopher, go ahead.
The NAACP is nonpartisan. I see our chairman,
The NAACP is nonpartisan, but Cornell need a contract.
So this packing of districts, this dilution of political power, it's part of the same strategy to take away political power from Latino and African American communities. It goes back to this war on voting that you just talked about, and really what it comes down to is the right cannot win on their ideas. In fact, their ideas are outdated and they're just plain wrong most of the time, and so they know the only way they win now is by shaving off Latino and African American votes. You talked about this race that was just won by 13 votes, and what's happened in a home state like Texas, where I'm from, they passed a law that says if you have a University of Texas student ID card, you cannot vote. But if you have a concealed
student ID card.
or an A&M
Right.
card, you can't vote. But if you have a concealed handgun permit, you can vote.
Right.
So you see the problem there. They're doing everything they can to limit and dilute political power. And it's a political issue, but it's also a personal issue for us and all of our communities. And I think about my own family, my own brother. My mom came into the country as a migrant farm worker, didn't get past 9th grade. She was picking cotton throughout the U.S., finally settled a family. But by the time my brother Richie and I came along, she was still working 3 jobs so that we would have a chance that she didn't have. And my brother, she always told us, if we set our hearts to it and we set our minds to it and we worked really hard, you could be whatever you wanted to be. Richie, my brother, always wanted to be president of the United States. It'll never happen. My brother's autistic, but he knows that voting is his voice, and he votes every single election time. But in 2012, that vote I was just telling you about, that law that said you have the wrong ID card, he went to vote in 2012. The law at the time said he had the wrong ID, but thanks to NAACP Legal Defense Fund and MALDEF and the Department of Justice, the law was in effect on November 6, 2012, a historic election. So he was able to vote by pure luck. The El Paso Times, our paper of record in El Paso, the New York Times of El Paso, was there and caught him coming out of the voting booth. And we got that picture framed at home right now. It was the best day of his life, but it shows why we have to work together to fight back against these laws that are really targeting our communities.
Dr. Barber, when we talk about this idea of voter suppression, you brought up can't use a college ID even though you went to a state university. Right. In Georgia, they actually passed a law, Stacey knows this, where it didn't even matter if you went to, if you went to Georgia Tech, you could. If you went to Morehouse Spelman, you couldn't. Public versus private. In Texas, they wouldn't even let you do it because it was even public. Dr. Barber, the thing though that is critical is advise folks on how we have to create the kind of coalitions to where you might have to go to white college students and say, hey, you're being screwed because of the folks who are in office. Exactly. You go to African Americans, it's a whole different message. You go to Latinos, it's a whole different message, where all of a sudden the issue is not party, the issue is not the D or the R, the issue is not conservative or liberal. The issue is really the issue.
That's right. Yes, agenda is moral, it's what it's about justice. NAACP, if you look at our history, we didn't win as black. When we started out, we weren't black. When W.B. Du Bois helped lead us in the fight against lynching, we didn't have any black people in the Congress. So we had to learn how to move on all sides of the aisle. When we fought to the Supreme Court with Brown, it was black and white and Jewish lawyers. Today, we have got to connect the dots. And there are a lot of people that are not with this extremism. I often tell folk about Forward Together Moral Movement. First of all, it's 64 weeks, but more importantly, 16% of the people that are Republicans are independents. 65% of the folk that went to jail are white, fighting for us in North Carolina, 65%. We're organizing in predominantly formerly Republican county. We have a Republican mayor right now walking 273 miles from Belhaven to Washington, D.C., going to D.C. to say to President Obama, I agree with you on Medicaid expansion, and I disagree with my governor, who's a Republican, and my Senate and my legislator, my Speaker, who's a Republican.
But the point there is that Republican mayor may say, I disagree with the president on 10 other issues.
Exactly.
But on this one, we agree,
right,
and we can't be unwilling to stand next to that person on that issue.
And we found that when it comes to voting, he also disagrees with politicians of
Some of y'all missed that one, but y'all gonna catch it in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, politicians of any hue. Listen, 61% of North Carolinians, period, disagree with politicians of any party messing with voting laws. We now have 61% would rather have a more limited voter ID. When you begin to talk not just about voter ID, but the total spam of voter suppression, in our lawsuit that Kim Keenan helped us figure out how to do, and the Advancement Project and others, we'll tell you who the coalition of that lawsuit. White women are in our lawsuit. Latinos are in our lawsuit. African Americans are in the lawsuit. 17-year-olds are in that lawsuit. And we're gonna win. We're gonna win that lawsuit because we didn't just go there about black people. We're showing that extremism is undermining everybody's fundamental civil rights. Now, one thing though we gotta understand, we filed that lawsuit 47 minutes after they signed it. Now, I thank God every day we were able to move quick through our process in the NAACP. We got people there 47. The governor signed it before the ink was dry. Bam, we were in his face. But it also shows that our position on the Voting Rights Amendment fix is right too. And our position that we passed in the board is, number one, we agree with starting the process. But the current bill has to be amended because you cannot have a bill. And I disagree with the Congresswoman. I love everything she said till she said you got to accept a half a loaf or no loaf. Because if we had accepted a half a loaf, and here and our good friends, in fact, I was at her Delta convention, she knows the position, but it ain't Barbara's position. It's the NAACP position. Because see, if you accept a half a loaf, that means give me the weekend off and keep me 5 days in slavery. If you accept a half a loaf, that means I'll march all the way across the Edmonds-Pettus Bridge, and if you give me 2 states in the South to have coverage, then I'm fine with that. We cannot allow, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you come to this convention, you cannot sign off on a voting rights amendment that leaves North Carolina uncovered, South Carolina uncovered, Alabama uncovered, Mississippi only covered for a year, Tennessee uncovered, Florida uncovered, and Virginia uncovered. We would have less rights today than we have tomorrow, and that's why every chance I go, I quote 2 people. My chairwoman that says, damn it, we got to have some courage in this generation. Oh, excuse me, I said damn. And Julian Bond, I'm sorry, Lord help me, Lord. But the Lord did damn that fig tree.
Ain't nothing wrong with
that. And I'm telling you, when I look at the fact that this voting law, suppression law has made Carolyn Coleman have to fight all over again after all she's been through, and Mary Perry, who's 80 years old, got to fight all over, and 92-year-old Rosanelle Eaton's got to fight over. Damn it, if they fighting, we ought to fight, and we ought to fight hard. We ought to fight hard. And as Julian Bond said, we need to say to every member of our Congressional Black Caucus, y'all better back me up, because this is our resolution. It's not my opinion. Y'all voted on it. You do not negotiate until you fight. You never negotiate till you fight.
Now, I'm trying to figure out where in the hell is the organist. You supposed to, that was the hoop part. Y'all got to get y'all new organists because they sleep. All right then. Yeah, where's the organ? We talk about problems, we talk about obviously identifying them, but also you have to have strategies moving forward. I want to speak to this, one of the issues, what's happening in Ohio with this Ohio Bill of Rights. That is a way to take advantage of a ballot position, to put it on the ballot. You talked about 61% of folks in North Carolina. Their State Representative Alicia Reese, who I think has already spoken here or is speaking here, is working with that initiative. That is a potential solution to dealing with these voting issues. Who wants to speak to that, and also other solutions that people can leave here with and they can start working on to enact in their states, in their cities, in their regions?
I want to jump in here. I think there I think a big strategy, and you're exactly right, when we look at, first of all, I think we have to be clear, in this country, we need a constitutional right to vote. I know it is people will say, oh, it's going to take years and years and years, but it's taken years and years and years to get a lot of stuff, but we still should have our eye on that North Star of a constitutional right to vote.
Right.
It's a long process, but it's a process that's needed, and it's a process that we have to be steadfast in ensuring that we're moving forward. I think we look at the State Bill of Rights that is on a ballot, that we're putting on the ballot in Ohio, but also looking at just a bigger strategy. I think there are three things. One, we've got to expand the electorate. Even in the midst of the laws that we have,
That's right.
we've got to expand the electorate. We have photo ID, we still need to show up anyhow and make sure we're voting. Number two, we've got to shift the narrative. We've got to change the conversation. We've got to make the conflict visible. And folks know, I'm from South Carolina, I've said this before, we've got to make the voter suppression conflict visible. My granddaddy always said, in the summertime, you got to cut the grass because you got to see the snakes in the grass. And
That's
so
right.
we
That's
have
right.
to make sure
That's
that we
right.
keep the grass cut so that we can see the
Now we-
snakes
now-
in
now
the
we
grass
know
that
you
Ryan's
country.
talking about. I'm very country. I'm very country. But it goes to our third point is that we've got to make sure that we are winning and defending and changing the game. The NAACP, we have game changers. So we have to make sure that we're getting our rights back. And we've got to make sure that we are expanding our rights because let's be real with ourselves. Pre-Shelby County v. Holder, it was not a utopia.
That's
we
right.
didn't have a utopia before Shelby County versus Holder, and it's worse now, but we still had a situation where 4.4 million people with felony convictions couldn't vote in our country. So we've got to be of the mindset where we are still playing defense, but we've also got to be playing offense as well.
And Stacey?
I would add, just to kind of expand on that, expanding the electorate, I lead the New Georgia Project. Between 2000 and 2010, 1.8 million people moved into Georgia. 70% of those folks were people of color. Right now, we have 800,000 unregistered African American, Latino, and Asian voters, and it takes 250,000 votes to change an election in Georgia. You want to expand the electorate, register those folks to vote. So we're doing that this year. Number two.
No, hold up. We got time. I don't want to rush over
Sorry.
that because that requires time and money.
does.
So explain the project and explain what your timetable is in order to hit those numbers.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked.
That's why I'm the moderator.
So we started the New Georgia Project. I actually started the nonprofit 16 years ago, but the New Georgia Project is focused on the 2014 election. And what we're trying to do is register 120,000 voters by the end of the summer, in part in reaction to the fact that we no longer have the protection of the Voting Rights Act, because this was the first time in Georgia since the 1960s that we will be able to register voters but not have the ability to go to the Justice Department in case there's any attempt to suppress those votes. So we need to get them registered in advance of the voter suppression coming. So we want them registered by August, so when they start trying to kick them off the rolls, we've got September and October to get them back on. And I want to say thank you to Francis Johnson. We're working very closely with NAACP in Georgia to get this work done. The second thing, though, is that before we started registering a single person, we spent almost $100,000 asking them why they weren't registered. If you're a black man who didn't vote, who didn't register to vote for Barack Obama in 2008 or 2010, why not? And the answer they gave us, number one, I'm afraid to vote. All I hear about is voter suppression. I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to vote. And more importantly, I don't know how to vote. I know that there are these newfangled machines, especially if you go outside the cities. They've never seen a voting machine. Those of us who grew up going to vote feel very comfortable with that. But if you've never voted, think about how intimidating that behavior is. If you come from a community, if we have a large Latino population whose hereditary homelands, voting is not something you get to do very easily without fear of death. If you're afraid of voting, why would you start? And so we worked to make sure that we understood why they weren't voting, and we connected the dots. It was making sure we understood why they needed to vote. So we did that research up front, and what we're doing once we register them to vote, we're doing the post-election conversation. The minute somebody registers, that's the beginning of the conversation. They now need to hear from us again to say thank you for registering, again to say here's when the election is coming, again to say here's why you need to vote. We get all excited the minute we register someone to vote. So our project is designed to be with them from start to election day and then the day after.
And to your point, I mean, that goes right into what you were talking about in terms of look, you want a road, this is how you get a road. And I want you to pick up on that because you talk about 800,000 in Georgia. Latinos alone, there are 2.1 million eligible but unregistered Latinos in Texas. You hear folks talk about the numbers. The numbers are irrelevant from a population standpoint unless they're registered, unless they vote.
Exactly
so
right.
Speak to Texas.
Right, and so if you think about just Texas for a minute and the demographic shift in that state, they picked up 4 congressional seats in the last redistricting cycle because of the massive Latino growth in the state. At the same time, they actually lost political power in the state because of redistricting and because people don't vote. A large number are unregistered. That's why I'm so glad about what you're doing in Georgia, very fast growing Latino population, and thank you for your work. And I totally agree with Joe Teca about expanding the electorate and advancing voting rights. And for us, I run the Latino Victory Project. It's a startup organization founded by Eva Longoria and Henry Munoz, and we're a small organization with lofty ambitions because we want to build political power, and the way we think we can do that is by building a pipeline of leaders like all of you who believe in voting rights and who will fight for the community, building a pipeline of donors because we have to invest in our own community. If we really want to win this, we've got to actually invest in our own communities. And then thirdly, building a pipeline of voters so that we have our voices heard, and then importantly, after Election Day. And I remember I was recently, I had the great pleasure of going with Joe Teca to Israel. We were just there a couple of months ago, and I remember she was introducing herself to a very important leader in politics there in Israel. And he said, "Oh, I know who you are. You're the NAACP, the oldest and largest civil rights organization." And then he turned to me and I said, "Oh, we're Latino Victory, the smallest and youngest civil rights organization, but we've got so much to learn and to work together, and that's what we aim to do."
If I can add one last piece to that. The other part of what we have to do, and this to me is as important, we keep complaining about the voter ID laws. Go and get people IDs. Every one of those rules has a solution. It's just harder to do. So part of the New Georgia Project is actually we now know any person we register, if they don't have an ID, we will get them an ID. We know where to go, and it's our responsibility now that we know that there's a problem. The challenge I have with progressives, and my party in particular, is that we get surprised by elections every single time. We don't know they're coming, we don't know we're going to have to do something, and we spend the last couple of weeks before an election trying to figure out how to win, as opposed to recognizing that the day we knew November the 7th, 2010, what was coming. We should have started getting people registered then. We should have started getting them IDs then. We now know in 2021, we're going to go through the same thing. There will be another redistricting. And if we do not take the time today and tomorrow and 2015 and 2016, if we do not take these chambers back and win these governor's races, we're going to be having the same conversation, only the difference is we will be a majority-minority South, a majority-minority nation. We will be the least educated, the least economically secure, the most incarcerated, and we will be led by a minority white conservative party because we never bothered to solve the problem, and we did not take our power back in advance of 2020.
I love that.
And it
Will.
also, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Flip to graph 4 for me because I want to talk a little bit more.
Go to Cornell's graph 4, please.
And some of the challenges that we have here. And it's so important because the information really is important because we did focus groups with people who turned out in 2008 and 12 and didn't turn out in 2010, and went into the conversation about midterms and quickly found out that we couldn't have a conversation about midterms, graph 4, not 7, because they didn't know what midterm was. Literally, they didn't know what a midterm was. I think we get so caught up in our conversations, in our information is luxury, people. I mean, we have the luxury of information, but so many people who are working, trying to hold down the jobs and keep their kids out of trouble, they're not tuning into MSNBC and CNN or Roland show. They literally don't know a midterm's coming, and they said, if I in fact knew a midterm was coming, I would vote. This is the problem. If the graphic up here, when you look at our coalition, look at where they were in 2010. 22 points less certain about voting, and they're at 20 points less certain about voting right now. If we don't get in the way of this, and they in fact increase their numbers across the board and empower themselves, I know we're not partisan here. However, it's going to be a real problem for all America because they are going to impeach the president. They may not successfully do it, but we're going to have 6 months of nothing being done in Washington but impeachment hearings. The other part about this is, flip to graph 7 for me on my presentation. I'm a poster. I have graphs.
Yeah, we know.
Flip to graph 7 for me. This is the problem this is why so much of this is happening. We are not post-racial. Graph 7 is the long graph that has from 64 to 2012. That one. This is a fascinating graph to me, folks. We're not post-racial.
Oh hell, we knew that.
I know some of us want to think that after 2008, but the truth of the matter is, white voters have not been voting progressive for a long time. And even with Barack Obama lost white voters by 20 points. However, you can still, the changes in the country mean you can lose white voters by 20 points and still be elected President of the United States and almost an electoral landslide. And they want to take their country back. We have to get in the way of that. And the last point I want to make, Roland, is this is important because from an investment standpoint, we wanted to go in Georgia in 2012, Representative Obama campaign. I actually did a couple polls there because we were thinking about going in Georgia. But the resources were such that we're going to get outspent X number of dollars in all these other states if we don't go in there. We have to stop looking for others to fund our empowerment. If we want to register, we have to fund it.
Now, and that's, so a couple of things. One, I was going to make that particular point because you talked about money as well. You talked about having a small organization, and you're absolutely right. These initiatives, first of all, these initiatives cannot, if we just cut to the chase, cannot be funded by parties. Because the moment the initiatives are funded by a party, then we know who wants to control the process. And the reality is you might go up against folks who may have funded that initiative from that party who really don't have your best interest at heart. And so you're right, we have to absolutely fund it ourselves. But also, and I want Dr. Barber to pick up on this point, this year marks the 30th anniversary of Reverend Jackson running for President of the United States. And the thing that folks forgot about that campaign is that he was talking to poor white people in West Virginia.
He won West Virginia.
He was talking to farmers in Iowa. He was saying then, if you want to actually achieve what we've all been talking about, you have to be able to get to people on what hits their pocketbooks, what affects them personally. And Dr. Barber, you wanted to pick up on that because that is a part of the coalition building to change that graph that Cornell talked about.
Yeah, we got to look at that, but we got to think outside the box because we're in a different moment. I think our president and CEO said a no ordinary time. And our danger sometimes is we believe the other side rhetoric, their report, more than we believe in our possibility. The reality is, listen, you talked about the vote ID, but there's another strategy. Like in our state, we're using injunctive relief. So that's why we can get an injunction so the laws can't go into effect. But on your point, Cornell, we've got to believe that we can organize in communities that may not have normally been polled or expected to vote. Yes. But we can't have a rally and do that, one. We can't have one convention and do that.
Well, you can have a rally on Saturday, but you better go to work on Monday.
You better go to work on Monday, right. So we've learned after 64 straight weeks of action, and now we have the Moral Monday is gone from Moral Monday at the legislature to the mass Moral March to the polls. And every Monday we're having something in communities we normally wouldn't be in. Live streaming, organizing, talking to people. We can build a different kind of coalition. We find that when we talk to people, the percentage numbers change. After 64 weeks, our governor was at 50% in the polls in April, called us outsiders, and one of his legislators called us morons. But now they're calling us trouble because now he's under 30% in the polls. He was at 40, the legislature was at 40% in the poll last April when we had the first 17 people to go do civil disobedience. Now it's been 1,004. Now that same legislature is at 17% in the polls. All the major newspapers and newspaper editorials said, oh, this ain't gonna work, it's just gonna be like Occupy. Now they are saying that the movement led by the NAACP and the 200 other organizations is the hope of the state. And major newspapers are reviewing where we stand. We can change the nature of the politics, and the pundits might be wrong, but we can't do it without a movement. And finally, the reason I mentioned civil disobedience, when people say, oh, Lord, they got the majority, the supermajority, nothing we can do. Well, if that was the case, we would have never left the plantation. You know, we would have never. What we said is we can always have the moral microphone. And the reason we did civil disobedience, not because somebody likes going to jail, But when a 93-year-old woman like Rosanelle Eaton leads 150 people into jail and 5 of them are 93, that's news for about 3 days. And what that does is it changes the narrative. So watch this. When Francis and Rosalind Brock and I and Julian and about 100 preachers go sit down in Boehner's office because he won't give us a voting rights fix, I bet you we make international news. And if we make international news, our folk gonna get fired up. Because they're gonna say, wait a minute, the fight is on. And sometimes with our folk, you either gotta mess with their mama or make them mad, or both.
Dr. Bart. The thing that jumped out the most, and again, we've heard it from different folks, that I want folks who are listening to understand is that you said this has been going on for 64 weeks.
64.
And the reason that's important is because many of us love to talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, but we often forget it was 381 days. And so we can't celebrate something that took more than a year, because what you're talking about is the exact same thing. You have to put the time in. So whether it's the Georgia project, whether it's Latino project in Texas, oftentimes we want the microwave solution when in fact it takes a lot longer.
And we've been building for 7 years.
Precisely. Will, well, you want to make a comment there?
I mean, I appreciate that point. It actually ties into something that Joe Taker said earlier about the need for us to have an affirmative strategy in this moment. You know, if we talk about the loss of Section 5's provision and its protection, but before Shelby County, things weren't good for us in lots of ways. And so I think it's important for us to be thinking about areas that are issues that are specific to your area. So if it's felon disfranchisement, in Alabama, 1 in 3 black men can't vote because of felony conviction. That's an issue that should be tackled and tackled mightily. And there's an opportunity now to begin advancing an affirmative agenda that focuses on that issue. If it's same-day registration to expand the electorate, we should be pushing that. I think of folks in Fayette County, Georgia, who under John Jones and Francis Johnson's leadership began many, many years ago to trot out a strategy to challenge at-large voting in that county. For more than 2 centuries, African Americans had not been able to elect a candidate of choice. There had never been an African American elected to the county school board or the county commission, even though qualified African Americans had run. So briefly, in 2006, there was a special election for county commission. There were several candidates who were black. There was one who was the vice chair of the Fayette County Republican Party, and he was also an attorney. There was another African American who was a Democrat who was a pilot, and there was a white gentleman who entered the race at the last minute, saying that he wanted to preserve the heritage of the county. He himself was a mechanic and had never registered to vote except when he decided to run. And this guy, our hero, the white fella who was a mechanic, won the election without a runoff. And that's an important story to the point about the salience of race in this moment. We have not achieved post-racial America. This election was an example of the way in which, if given a chance, white folks often don't vote for black folks, even if they're of the same party, be it a Republican Party. In Fayette County, Georgia, because of their organization and a lawsuit that was ultimately brought, we got a federal judge to strike the way that they elected their candidates to the county commission and the school board, struck the at-large election method and required district-based voting with the recognition that race still determines how people vote. And in Fayette County, they were using the way that race shapes how people vote with their at-large method of election, and the federal district court judge struck that. So I think, to Joe Taker's point, this is really an important moment for us to be advancing an affirmative agenda on voting rights. We talk a lot about how by 2042, the Census Bureau predicts that America will be a majority people of color nation. And that is exciting, but that's only meaningful if we understand the power connected to us being a majority of the country. Our sheer numbers as a majority alone won't mean much if we don't have specific plans articulated to advance our vision for democracy in this country.
I need mic 8 turned on. Joe Taker is going to have a couple of comments. Then we're going to go questions from the audience. And clearly, y'all, Chairman Ross Brock want to be the moderator because she's telling me, we got 30 minutes left. I got a clock. I got this.
Hey, now, Roland.
You knew I was going to say something, so I don't know why you know I'm going to call you out. Predictor, go right ahead. Turn the mic on so I got questions.
I got it. Hey, now, Roland, that's our chairman now, you know. But I want to, yeah, you've been calling me Joe Taka all day.
I'm
He
call
knows
you
my
all
name
of
is Joe
them.
Taker, but he just likes to call me Joe Taka.
Just to mess with you.
But I do want to jump in because a good point that you made, and I think you referenced 64 weeks of Moral Monday. The work that is being Moral Mondays is now moving throughout the South. The NAACP, we are at that hashtag is hashtag NAACP 105. We have been around for 105 years, and we have sustained this fight for civil and human rights for 105 years. And to your point, Ryan, we have to have a strategy, we have to be affirmative, but we also have to sustain. And I think we've got to get ourselves out of this popcorn activism. Right. We want to pop in, pop out, pop in, pop out, and no one wants to stay in for the sustained time that we know we need to stay in to do the work. So I think that's important. I think we have this whole issue of delayed gratification. We want it to happen right then and right now. And I know that the work for justice is long and hard, but we've got to stay in the game. And the other point is that we actually have power and we have numbers. And I think, and it goes to Cornell's point, that if we do not turn out in November, if we do not illustrate and we do not put back the power that we illustrated in 2008 and in 2012, if we fail to do that in 2014 in November, shame on us. Shame on us. Shame on us if we do not turn out and illustrate that power that we have.
All right, then. Now it's time for questions. I know I wasn't the only one. Did y'all, somebody feel the floor move? Y'all like, what just happened? I just want to recognize that. All right, here's the deal. Now put your hand down. We got rules. I got the microphone. Yes, you don't need to hold it. Yes, sir. If you grab the mic, I'm going to hit your hand. Yes, sir. Are we clear? That's why I'm out here. Your name, where you from, and a question, not a sermonette.
My name is Can you hold it up?
I got this. Okay. I went to school for this. I got this.
You got it. Okay. My name is Professor Tinnerman, and I am from Houston, Texas. I hope I'm not changing the discussion, but this is very important to me. A couple weeks ago, President Obama announced that he has completed and given the gay community everything they wanted. He's working on immigration to give the Latino community everything they want. What is the NAACP asking of President Obama for the next 2 years so that we can go on television and hear President Obama say to us, the NAACP has asked for X, Y, and Z, and I have done just that.
Gotcha.
What are we asking from and for President Obama to do?
I got you. Now, here's the deal. There's no need to line up, because that's why, y'all stay right here. Nobody else hop in line, because I'm going to walk around the room. You can take a seat. Okay. Who wants to answer that question? Dr. Barber, answer that question. I'm going to the next question.
Well, as a political action chair, first of all, we ask all, not just President Obama.
Everybody.
We ask all of the Congress, the President, our 5 game changers that deal with economic sustainability, educational equality, health care for all, access to the Affordable Care Act, dealing with injustice in the criminal justice system, and expanding and protecting voting rights. The reality is, and this is why this conversation about changing states and elections is so important, most of what we want from the president wants to do, but the Congress has said from day one that they were not going to allow anything. And you have a Congress that even if it will help their people, they're refusing to vote on anything. Y'all get that? So does that mean, though the NAACP is not Democrat, not Republican, we push everybody. But right now, the major issue is we have an extremist takeover Congress. I don't even call them Republican. Tea Party extremists who are blocking, anytime folk will criticize the First Lady for just wanting children to have vegetables, you're not dealing with people who have political or common sense.
But Dr. Barber, I will say that first of all, there is a report card the NAACP actually issues, and it ranks every single member. You can go to the website to check that out. But I will say this, and we also have to be honest when we talk about holding folks accountable, and that is we also have to be willing to put something on the line to hold folks accountable. Now, you're absolutely right. The LGBT community presented the president with a 54-page plan the moment he walked in office. There were folks who handcuffed themselves to the gate outside of the White House.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to hold him, CBC, other members of Congress, black mayors, governors. What we also cannot do is say, well, the brother got loud on his plate, we don't really want to say anything, because our agenda has always been our agenda. He is the first black president, but he's also the 44th.
And Roland,
So,
Roland,
real quick, and then I'm going to the next question.
Well, just so the person would know, everything I just mentioned, and I want y'all to get that game changer, I want you to get the action step. All of that has been presented to the president. All of it has been presented to each party, by that matter,
right,
and all of the Congress. The issue is how do you get it implemented? And we're constantly fighting for, and that's why this voting fight is so important.
Yeah, but Dr. Barber, you need, what the president needs and the chair needs, you need the people to also show up. You can have a battle plan with generals, but you don't win nothing with no troops.
Exactly.
Next question.
My question is, what are you doing about the fees that they charge to run for office? In my congressional district, it costs less than $100 to run for Congress on the Republican ticket. It did cost $4,000 to run on the Democratic ticket. And when we got our first African-American female to run in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for Congress, they raised that fee to $6,000, so she wouldn't be able to run, but she did run again.
All right, so that's in Pennsylvania? All right.
So I just jump in. Again, I just want to reiterate the NAACP, we're a nonpartisan organization. And just a slightly alteration, you're talking about just money and politics, I think. And it's not exactly to your question, but I do think we have to begin to deal with this issue of the influx of money in politics. We recently saw Citizens United, which unleashed, when money and corporations became people. And we just saw the McCutcheon decision, McCutcheon versus FEC, where now an individual can give upward to $117,000 to a candidate or a political PAC, when most of us don't even make $117,000. And so we've got to begin to also deal with the other side of the attack on voting rights, which is this influx of money in politics, which is intentionally diluting and drowning out our voice.
Roland, can I just jump? No, you go first, please.
Oh, I was going to answer on the specifics of the fees charged to run for office. There are fees that your state may charge to actually run the elections, but parties charge a fee to raise their money. If you are partisan, as I am, so not the New Georgia Project is nonpartisan. Stacey Abrams, the House Minority Leader, is partisan. The party makes the decision. So if you are part of your party, much like any other organization, the people who show up make the decisions. If you want the fees to go down, more people have to show up and demand that those fees go down. It is decided by the party how much they're going to charge to be able to enter a race.
Roland, can I just say two things about this real quick? So Jotika's right. We've got a money and politics problem in this country, right? Citizens United open up the floodgates for all of this money to come into the system. We've got to push back in two ways. One is we have to flood the system with our votes. But secondly, money in politics isn't going away anytime soon, so we've also got to invest in our candidates like Stacey and others. If we want to see real change, we've got to do it with our pocketbook and our vote. The only thing I'll say is there's a strategy here where we can actually springboard from that terrible decision, Citizens United, and actually move the ball forward. We talked a lot about how we need to regain some of the losses that we had after Shelby. We spend a lot of time in these fights, and we need to have these fights, but we also need to start looking ahead with the real vision for the next 50 years. We're celebrating the 50 years of the Civil Rights Movement. What do the next 50 years look like? And I agree with both of you when you said we need an affirmative right to vote. And I don't think it's going to take that long if we can get another vote on the Supreme Court so that we have a majority of folks in the Supreme Court that believe in voting rights. What we can do is take the Citizens United ruling, which actually said for a corporation to influence your vote with money, that's free speech. It's protected under speech. That's how they did it. Well, if somebody given money to influence my vote is speech, what about my actual vote? Why isn't that speech? And once we can convince the court that voting is speech, then we'll have a constitutional right to vote, and then we won't have all of these terrible laws that are striking down our ability to build power.
Next question. Roland, may I mention one thing? But on this money thing, we got to come out of the stratosphere. You know, everybody talks about the Koch brothers. We got to drill down and find the money in your state. And then, and what we found is there's this guy in our state called Art Pope that put $44 million of his own money to take over the state legislature, and now he's budget director. Well, you know, we can't do boycotts. You know, we can't do boycotts, but we called Brother Ford and called Kim Keenan and said, can we do informational pickets at his stores and take our game changers, and we had up here his face, our game changers, the people he supported, and how they voted against our game changer. And we didn't tell people not to buy it. We just told people who they were spending their money with.
Exactly. That's great.
And identified him as the local Koch brother. You see, so we got to bring this stuff out of the atmosphere. There's somebody in your state,
right,
that's got some bank, and they probably have some businesses, and while we may not be able to boycott them, we can do informational pickets in front of those businesses.
Next question.
My name is Alvin O. Chambliss, Jr. I'm the last original civil rights lawyer in America, former law professor, winner of 2 out of 3 Supreme Court decisions. In 1981, there's a case that I litigated, I lost 5-4, City of Memphis versus Green, 451 U.S. 100, 1981. And that case was on the badges and incidents of slavery, 13th Amendment. My question, of course, is when you talk about expanding the electorate, tell me how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment combined jointly and not severable citizenship, and that's 13th, 14th, and 15th, jointly and not severable. How does that not expand the electorate?
Ryan?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a terrific question. Obviously, and I really appreciate
and you run that resume down again, I'm gonna cut you.
Yeah, right.
only because you taught at TSU across from Jack Yates High School did I let you do that. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the answer is that we rely heavily on those amendments to expand our voting rights. As the professor knows, and as the Supreme Court litigator who won 2 out of 3 cases knows, we rely on the 15th Amendment, which is the thing that enforces our right to vote. That is the thing that is the basis for the Voting Rights Act. So all of these cases rely on the protections provided by the amendment to the Constitution. And in several of the cases being litigated now in North Carolina, which challenges the photo ID measure and other things, in Texas, we're using the 15th Amendment and arguing that some of those laws were intentionally enacted to deprive people of color of the right to vote. So we're very much relying on those protections in this moment.
All right, then. I take it you're AKA Wallace Pink and Green on.
My brother. Thank you for this.
Get your hand off the mic. Put your hand down. I got this.
0608 still. How's that? Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Carla Campbell-Jackson from Kalamazoo, Michigan. My question is, what are some of the tactics and the schemes that are being used to dissuade our people from voting? I think we need to go back with practical information so that we can let our folks know what to avoid.
I can jump in.
Well, one of the things that happened in Ohio in the last election, they actually erected billboards in black neighborhoods that dealt specifically with voting to actually scare folks to prevent them from voting. And so, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think there maybe you could say if you look at categories, because I think there's one category which is just mass confusion. The billboards that we saw in Ohio that said voter fraud is a felony. And it was a scare tactic. They were only put in black neighborhoods. We also saw in Maryland, there's a lot of deceptive practices where people will get robocalls telling them that the election is on Wednesday. I mean, it's some of the things that are happening. So you have these deceptive practices, and we've also got to deal with this whole Tea Party, poll watching, and all of this intimidation at the polls.
That's the real voter
that is
fraud.
very real in our communities, where there's massive amounts of folks that are coming to the polls in mass numbers with the sole purpose of challenging you at the polls. challenging your name. So we have those type of deceptive practices. But there are also these laws, and I know Ryan can speak to this as well, but we need to look out for a couple of things right now in this post-Shelby world. Number one, if in your local community, your local election board decides that they want to move from a single member district to an at-large, that's a red flag. Because when that happens, it means that it dilutes our power base. Number two, when they want to annex an entire part of a community out of the city limits, and this stuff is happening. Number three, when they want to remove or move polling places, because these polling places that are being removed are mostly out in our neighborhoods, and also when they want to change where they are. In Athens, Georgia, there was a proposal for a polling location to be at the local police station. So we've got to make sure that yes, that's the problem. Who really gonna go in the police station? You know, just go walk up in there. But we've got to watch.
Oh hell, I'll walk in there.
We've got to watch for these type of changes. So, and then also some of the redistricting. We've got to be the eyes and ears. The NAACP has a national vote watch program. You can go to our website, report these changes, but it's important for you. You got to read the newspaper and read the little small print in the back about these changes, because it's written in small letters, and you got to show up to the election board meetings. 2 or 3 at election board meeting can actually stop some of this voter suppression. That's what's been happening in places like Georgia and places like in Alabama, and these small places that are making these very bad changes.
But we also have to recognize that we can complain about them showing up to be poll monitors. We can monitor the same poll.
Absolutely.
And we can go to their neighborhood.
We can show up as poll monitors.
And poll workers.
We can show up as
Get
poll
that
monitors.
church bus and roll to the other side of town.
I think there are 3 things. One, the affirmative is to show up as poll watchers. We have the same rights to be poll watchers as they do. We just don't show up. 2, we should actually send letters ourselves. The same billboards they send out. One of the things Sasha Eisenberg's The Victory Lab showed is that if you will write a letter to a person and explain their right to vote and their obligation to vote, if it comes in an official-looking envelope, they will read it, and that will heighten their awareness of an election. We keep thinking that people are watching TV. I think Cornell said it. They're not watching television. They're not paying attention to these things. But if they get something in the mail that looks like it might be important, that's how you tell them this election matters. That letter can increase their likelihood of voting by up to 5%. You increase voting by 5% in most of these elections, we change the country.
But it's also mean canvassing neighborhoods as well. Dr. Barber, 30 seconds, next question.
Yeah. What they're trying to do, I call it dip. That first of all, we got to be careful of our own depression. You know, seeing ourselves as grasshoppers. There's nothing we can do. They don't tell us. They're not going to tell you that the demographics are so. In most of these southern states, if you get 18% of white folk to vote their future, not their fears, and black folk to really turn out, it's a new day. And so the first thing we have to do is stop being depressed and stop singing these songs about Jesus gonna fix it by himself. I mean, by himself. You know, and the Lord gonna fight your battles and just stand still. You know, when Moses said stand still, God said you better not stand still. You better use what's in your hand. Secondly, intimidation. We had a group last week that wanted to put on masks and go into a voting place, take a picture that they were going to send over to show what voter fraud looked like. We have people riding around with trucks with Obama hanging. We've had that. You just got to forget the intimidation and say people went through a worse, just laugh at them. And then the last thing is process. I don't care if the line is 50 miles long. Remember South Africa.
There you go.
Remember South Africa. And stay in that line. Stay in there. Let us fight the battles in the courts, but you stay right in. My mother is 81 years old, Roland. She integrated the schools in Washington County. She goes to work every morning at 6:30. I said, Mama, why do you go to work? She said, well, boy, she don't even call me that. She said, when I first went there, they didn't want me there, and they called me the N-word. Now I'm going to stay right here till I get ready to leave. And that's what we have to do. I don't care what the process is. Stay right there.
Next question.
Yes, my name is John E. Jones. I'm the person that Ryan Haygood referred to in Fayette County, Georgia. I'm the president of the branch. And that's what I do in my spare time. I'm a commercial airline pilot. But what I want to, the question that I have is that in 2015, it will be the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. What are we doing to commemorate that Voting Rights Act passage? And one of the things that I would like to do is to put a focus on Fayette County, because even though through Ryan Haygood's and LDF's efforts, we got district voting, these people are appealing that decision, wasting our taxpayer dollars, and we want to shine a bright spotlight on Fayette County, Georgia, a small suburb just south of Atlanta Airport, so that the whole world will know how crazy these people are.
Let me say this here. Because we saw in 2013, we've seen in 2014, lots of commemorations, lots of celebrations, and that's fine. That's fine. I mean, we saw a week-long effort when it came to Freedom Summer, this summer as well. What I would say is the best way to commemorate or recognize is to continue to make sure it's still in place. Frankly, I'm not necessarily interested in another program, another gala, another gospel concert. My deal is the way to do it is by 2015, make sure this Congress has passed that law to put Shelby v. Holder back in place. That's where the effort is. And the other thing is for us to, again, to keep moving it and having a short, mid-range, and long-term plan. Because we're talking about the Georgia project, you're talking about being in Georgia. The reality is this here. You hit those numbers, you flip the state. Exactly. You flip the state, you flip the budget. You flip the budget, you change people's lives. And that really, I think, is the strategy as well. And so you say the written plan, holla at Stacy, because she's going to be working on that plan. Next question.
How are you doing? My name is Sugar Stallings, attorney at law, a call to action talk show host, and thank you for the honorable guests on the panelists and Mr. Roland Martin. I won't touch your microphone.
Yeah, but you touching me right now, but go ahead.
Oh, Lord, I don't know.
Duly noted. My question is, I live on the Gulf Coast, and we had one of the most historic elections with African Americans turning out for Thad Cochran. Now, my question to you is, how can we get our people to not think that the primary and the general election are two separate dates and not important, but that the primary is important? Because of the runoff, he was able to win with our vote pushing him over the edge. So my thing is, what can we do as African Americans, not only to use our power, our voice, so it can be heard, but for people who are against us in the voting acts and different other things who are never listening to our voice, to do with this power that we are presenting today, push forward to get our voice heard when they're in D.C.?
Well, I'll say the first thing is black folks should be lining up in D.C. at Cochran's office saying, what you gonna do for us? But one of y'all wanna answer that question?
I think, and our Mississippi State Conference president, Derek Johnson, is in here, and they are doing that. You see the interviews. We've got to be clear, and it goes back to this point of holding every elected official accountable on both sides of the aisle. I think we've got to be on both sides of the aisle, because I want to recall the late, great Shirley Chisholm. We got to keep reminding ourselves that we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, but a permanent interest. And we've got to keep our eyes on that. And so we've got to make sure that we recognize when we turn out in these primary elections, we're actually beginning to shape the political system and who's in power. And as we do that, we begin to yield how that power is used, and it ultimately affects our lives.
We got 3 minutes left, so Cornell, make this quick, and then I want to get 2 more questions, and then we have to close.
I'm bringing it back around because I'm going to stay on message. What's important to understand is that in Mississippi, they did something remarkable. They actually, Republicans spent money on chasing the African American vote. And again, it gets back to this idea that we have to invest. We have to invest. This organization needs to have a voter mobilization program funded. We can't wait on other people to empower our mobilization. And my last point is the best way for us to honor sort of the civil rights is, in fact, for us to turn out and vote. Look, in 2012, 2008, the most likely voter looked like her. if we want to honor that movement, let's make 2010 the most likely, the next election most likely vote look like us again. That's how we honor that.
And we need to shift your graph. We need to shift Cornell's graph so he comes back and his graph is different.
And again, for folks who didn't quite understand it, 2008, black women voted at a higher rate than any other group in America. In 2012, black women voted at a higher rate than anybody else. Which is why I've been saying, if there's a Supreme Court vacancy, black women should be saying, Mr. President, appoint a black woman. I got to get to the next question.
Hello, Roland. Gordon Jackson, formerly of Dallas, Texas, and the Dallas Weekly, where Roland was an editor at one time.
Man, come on, ask your question. We got 3 minutes.
I'm now in Biloxi, Mississippi, and it was touched on about the Thad-Cochran Senate race. But looking forward, with all the strategy, with all the situation around the redistricting of states, red states, blue states, red districts, blue districts, how soon should we be looking at 2020 and getting ready to look at redistricting in the future?
Well, I need one person to answer the next question.
Okay, what we're doing, when you vote now, you say, what should we do for the Voting Rights Act? We should activate the vote. You are looking forward at 2020 because you've got to work at changing these state legislatures now if you're going to have the right people in place in 2020. Yep. Roland, quickly, the other thing I would say is Derek is over there. Derek did a very powerful interview you need to look at on MSNBC. They asked him a question about Cochran and the other guy. He said, but what are we really getting? Because both of them are Tea Party. We can't allow people to run like Cantor, where he wasn't really Tea Party. Look at his record. It's not whether you call yourself Tea Party, it's the record. It's the record. And so part of the thing I think we have to do is not get caught up in the rhetoric or even in the money, but in the record. And if we in 2020, it is critical now. We don't just need a softer version of the Tea Party. We need some new tea. Or, well, really what we need is a coffee.
We need some coffee.
Black.
Question?
In the northern states, I'm from Newark, New Jersey. In the northern states, how do we address the GOTV voter suppression by people of color who have co-opted partisan politics in their own advancement? New Jersey received Governor Christie because of GOTV voter suppression in black communities, both in the primary and the general election.
Who wants to answer?
It's called taking people to a political woodshed. If you know who they are in your own state, you have to take them to the political woodshed if they have used your community and what they did in your community or what they suppressed in your community has served to your advantage. People have to pay a price in politics, even if they look like you.
Final comments, Representative Abrams.
I'll echo what Reverend Barber said. Being elected is a job.
Right.
We get a job evaluation every 2 years or every 4 years, and if you're in the U.S. Senate, every 6 years. How many of you have ever had a job where your evaluation didn't come, or when you got evaluated and people thought you sucked and you got to keep your job? We have to fire politicians. I mean myself too. If I don't do my job, I don't deserve to have my job. And the problem is black politicians are as complicit in our demise as anybody else. When we draw lines to keep ourselves in office, when we suppress votes because we want to get a bill passed the next time, when we decide that I'd rather not have to work hard, so I'm just going to go along to get along, then we don't deserve to have these jobs. But the only way you can fire us is by turning out to vote. And if you go to vote by yourself, you are committing a sin. It is immoral to vote alone. And if we don't remember that in November, we deserve what we get.
Will, final comment. Will?
Ryan?
Ryan, I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. You know, I think again, it is an important moment that we're in now. We have to have an affirmative voting rights agenda. We are upon the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act next year, and the reality is it'll be unlike any of the 49 previous ones we saw, having sustained a devastating blow in the Supreme Court in Shelby County. But that should motivate us, I think, in this moment to take personally what the Supreme Court has done to us and how they reflected that they're very, very far away from the harm that we've experienced over time and we must know the conditions under which we live in our local jurisdictions, identify those voting rights practices that have been discriminatory, if it's felon disfranchisement practices, if it's at-large voting, if it's annexations, if it's moving or closing polling places, whatever it is, we have to be experts on those issues in our local areas, and then we have to advance an affirmative voting rights agenda that we begin now to think about in 10 years. Someone asked about when does redistricting start? The Census Bureau is actually starting now to prepare for the 2020 census. So it is true that when people seek to achieve goals, they plan to get those. They don't just stumble upon them and then find victory. It is a thoughtful process that's strategic and intentional, and we need that in this moment.
Mr. Alex?
I agree with that. We've got a plan now for 2020. There's something very special that happens in 2020, which is a presidential election following at the same time as census, then the redistricting cycle. And if we're not ready to run a record number of Latino and African American candidates, if we're not ready to turn out a record number of Latino and African American voters, we're not going to be able to draw those lines and control policy for the balance of the century. But if we are ready and we work together now, we'll be victorious.
Joe Tika?
Well, you know we got a gospel concert tonight and we got an organist, so I'm going to do a little call and response. I want you to look at your neighbor. I want you to say, neighbor. Say, neighbor.
Neighbor.
What's happening?
What's happening?
Is an attempt.
Is an attempt.
To shift.
To shift.
Power.
Power.
Neighbor.
Neighbor.
What's happening?
What's happening?
Is an attempt.
Is an attempt.
To shift.
To shift.
Power.
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 Power. Remind yourself that every day because we have the power to do something about it. That's what I want to say to everybody today. We've got to make sure that we understand that we can do something about this. But what's happening is a fundamental shift, attempt to shift power in our nation. Those that are against us, we are in an epic battle in our country with those who wish to redefine the moral center of our nation. And we have to recognize, as Elaine Jones said earlier today, that we are in a war. We cannot afford to play checkers when we're in the middle of a chess game.
Thanks, Reverend Jackson. Mr. Belcher.
I didn't know I had to do a closing remark. I can't follow that.
Yes, you can. Fake it.
Look, look. It's important that I'm fearful for the future. I'm fearful for the future if we don't act, because I go out around the country and I talk to voters and I talk to young people, and they are not engaged right now. And if they are not engaged and we don't come back out, all that we've talked about is lost. And we're going to look at not only them taking more power in the state ledges, but seriously, people. You think things are bad in Washington right now? You think Washington doesn't work right now? It's going to only get worse. We have the power, but we need to empower our organizations. And again, I stay on message. This organization is going to put together a voter mobilization program. We better be raising money and trying to fund it, because we can't look for others to empower our empowerment.
Dr. Barber, fellow alpha man.
Fellow alpha. Oh, shit. Oh, I'm sorry.
Don't start.
I'm sorry.
Everybody couldn't get in.
I'm sorry. Well, first of all, when I see 40 young people in our state that are working in 37 counties to register 50,000 people over the next 10 weeks, and they're using something called a 25-10 plan. Get 20 people or 20 organizations to register one person a day for 5 days. In 10 weeks, that's 1,000 people. If you do that in 50 counties, that's 1,000. Break these big things down into small pieces. I'm very hopeful when I see that. When I see miracles like going to Mitchell County, that's 89% Republican, going with our 5 game changers and meeting with those people and talking to them as Lincoln Republicans and staying with them for 2 hours at night until finally they announce at 10 at night. Well, the really reason we invited you up here is because the Republican chair has renounced the party because it's been taken over by Tea Party folk, and he's not a Tea Partyist. He's a Roosevelt, Eisenhower Republican. We can build some fusion movement, but we got to believe it ourselves. If you don't believe your own stuff works, then it's not going to ever work with somebody else. And then finally, Roland, when I think about where we are, there are 2 things. One of them is the scripture. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, "Woe unto those who pass unjust laws and rob the poor of their right." Isaiah 10. You know, we've got to recover moral language because we got cute, y'all. We got cute, and we started talking about, you know, the politics and the Democrat. But there's still some people that believe in right and wrong. And that thing said, woe unto those who pass unjust law, who rob the poor. There's a robbery being attempted in America. It's called grand theft democracy. And somebody better sound the alarm, and somebody better run these robbers out of the house. And if the NAACP wants to always call ourselves the big dog, well, we better take the big dog off the chain and let the big dog go get these robbers. And then finally, President Obama ought to move you. These folk attacking us ought to move us. These policies and game changer. But the one thing that ought to move us is that every right we have was dipped in blood. And so you know how in Texas they said, remember the Alamo? You ought to go back home and organize and say, remember the blood. Don't care what the Tea Party says, remember the blood. Don't care what kind of suppression they put in front of us, remember the blood. And if the blood can't motivate you, if the way folks sacrifice can't motivate you, then there's no motivation in us anyway.
I will, Dr. Barber, thank you very much. I will close our session with this. We have folks on the stage here, other folks sitting out here who certainly have taken leadership positions when it comes to breaking down the walls of voter suppression, breaking down the battles in the courtrooms, breaking down the battles at the ballot box. But for folks who actually read their Bible, they will realize that Nehemiah was a leader who understood, who had a vision to rebuild the wall. But if you actually read that, after he laid out the plan of action, the people then replied, let us rebuild. So you've sat in this session, you've sat in other sessions, and you've heard folks talk about what is required in the midterms, what is required for 2016 and 2020. You've seen polling numbers. You've seen examples of what took place when people were motivated in Texas. You see what's happening when it comes to Moral Monday in North Carolina. But it requires for the people to say, let us rebuild. Leadership has laid down the vision. Leadership has laid out the game plan, but the people must rebuild. And since Dr. Barbara Fellow Alpha talked about fighting, I listened to one of our jewels, Vertner Woodson Tandy, who said in 1937, very simply, we must fight till hell freezes over, and then we fight on the ice.
Thank you all. First of all, I want to thank our moderator, Mr. Martin, for doing such a superb job. I want to thank the leadership of this organization, Chairman Brock, for giving us this type of information we can take back. Now we will have the benediction by Rabbi Mintz. Please stand.
We are all members of a multidimensional country, one that has proven greatly challenging at times, and yet filled with glorious possibilities. And now, as members of an interfaith community sharing a reverence for life and a deeply rooted mission to arrest the sense of alienation, we understand that we live in reciprocal relationship to one another and have a sense of purpose to fulfill the sacred potential of our country. History has made us aware of that imperative. And Dr. Barber mentioned courage. The courage to act is an attribute of the heart, which has allowed us to rise to greatness, even during moments of despair. The late, great Maya Angelou said, "One isn't necessarily born with courage, but one is born with potential. Without courage, we cannot practice any other virtue with consistency. We can't be kind, we can't be true, we can't be merciful, we can't be generous, we can't be honest." Avarachamim, bless all those present with courage, with perseverance, wisdom, unity of purpose, mutual commitment, and courage. May they go forth from this gathering energized, revitalized, and imbued with a heightened consciousness. May we all benefit from one another, keep open an ability to communicate and dialogue with one another, and with God's help, may we go from strength to strength. Amen.